Here's the unthinkable. A starving predator storms into a packed community center, turning a quiet meeting into a scene of carnage. This chilling story from the Arctic tells the tale of a desperate polar bear attacking a close-knit village, leaving destruction and loss in its wake. But what drove the bear to such brutal extremes? And how did the survivors fight back? Join us as we unravel this harrowing tale of survival and sacrifice. It was November 11th, 2024, and the air inside the community center in a remote Alaskan village was thick with unease, a palpable tension woven into the heated murmurs of the gathered villagers. Outside, the unseasonably warm night clung to them like a second skin. This uncharacteristic heat had disrupted the rhythm of their lives. Polar bears were no longer an occasional sight, but a looming threat. Hungry and desperate, they stalked closer to the village every day. The villagers knew they had to act before tragedy struck, because they knew it would certainly strike. But suddenly, as the villagers debated various solutions to their problems, the tension in the room fractured. A loud thud, then the unmistakable groan of stressed hinges. The door to the center buckled inward, splinters flying like shrapnel. There was no time to process the massive form that barreled through the opening, its white fur streaked with dirt. A starving polar bear, skeletal beneath its once proud frame, roared into the hall, its breath a visible mist of menace. Chaos erupted instantly. Chairs screeched against the floor, bodies surged in every direction, and the collective gasp of fear seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. The bear lunged, its massive paws swiping with lethal precision. The first victim, Victor, a man near the front, was thrown back as if struck by a freight train. He hit the floor motionless, blood pooling beneath him. But the bear's rage was far from appeased. It moved through the panicked crowd with terrifying speed, a predator unbound by the confines of walls. Another swipe caught Sarah, a fleeing woman, sending her sprawling into a table. Sarah's scream was cut short as the beast pinned her, its jaws snapping down with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed, painting the stark walls in horrifying strokes. People shoved and trampled each other in their desperation to escape, but the single exit was a bottleneck of terror. The bear advanced on a cluster of villagers, its claws raking across torsos and limbs with an efficiency that spoke of primal hunger. A 15-year-old boy named Jack fell, his eyes wide with disbelief as the beast descended on him. The wet sounds of flesh tearing were a nightmare made real. Someone hurled a chair. It splintered harmlessly against the bear's thick hide. Another man, Ethan, swung a broken broomstick, the jagged end aimed at the predator's flank. It pierced, but barely. The bear roared, more fury than pain, and swatted the weapon from his grip. Ethan stumbled, scrambling backward, but the bear was faster. One swipe and his body crumpled like a discarded rag doll. The scene was surreal, nothing but carnage in a space meant for safety and unity. Papers from the meeting were scattered across the floor, stained crimson. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, their hum the only gentle sound in a room of screams. A group of hunters who had come prepared sprang into action in the far corner. Armed only with what they could find, a fire poker, a meat cleaver, and a pair of hunting knives, they moved with grim determination. One of them, Tom, a grizzled elder with decades of survival etched into his face, barked a silent signal. They fanned out, positioning themselves between the bear and the remaining villagers who cowered behind overturned tables and debris. The first hunter struck with the cleaver, aiming for the bear's exposed ribs. The blade bit deep, eliciting a roar that shook the very walls. The bear twisted, its massive paw catching the man across the chest. He staggered, blood pouring from 3 deep gashes, but he held his ground, shouting a wordless challenge that drew the bear's focus. The others seized the moment. The fire poker came down in an arc, slamming into the bear's skull with a clang. It stumbled, but even starvation couldn't fully dull its instincts. It lashed out blindly, catching one hunter by the arm and yanking him off his feet. The man screamed as bones snapped, his weapon clattering uselessly to the floor. The remaining hunters sprang into action. One lunged forward, his knife plunging into the bear's neck. Hot blood spurted across his face as he twisted the blade, trying to sever something vital. The bear roared again, louder, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. It threw itself into a furious spin, dislodging the knife in the hunter, who was flung against the wall with a bone-crushing thud. It was then that Tom, the elder, saw his chance. With the others buying precious seconds, he approached from behind, gripping the fire poker like a spear. The bear reared up on its hind legs, its full height dwarfing everything around it. The elder's breath caught, but he didn't falter. He thrust upward, deepening the metal tip into the bear's throat. The creature gurgled, its roar reduced to a wet, strangled gasp. Blood gushed, soaking the floor as the bear collapsed onto all fours, its strength finally failing. Even its final moments were filled with wrath and desperation. Its claws scraped at the ground, dragging its enormous body forward in one last futile attempt to attack. Tom stepped back, his hands trembling, his face a mask of exhaustion and sorrow. With a final shudder, the bear stilled, its massive frame crumpling to the floor. The following silence was broken only by the sobs of the injured and the gasps of those who had survived. The floor was a grim tableau of destruction, shattered furniture, discarded weapons, and the broken bodies of 10 villagers who hadn't escaped the beast's wrath. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid sting of fear. As the surviving hunters tended to the wounded, the reality of what had transpired settled over them like a suffocating blanket. The bear's attack wasn't just a freak incident, but evidence of a deeper crisis. Starvation and desperation had driven a predator to madness, and the fragile balance between humans and wildlife was irreparably shattered. Tom knelt beside the bear's lifeless form, his calloused hand resting on its blood-matted fur. Its sunken eyes stared blankly, a haunting reminder of what desperation could do. Around him, the villagers began to gather, their faces etched with grief and anger. The debate would come later, how to protect their community without further endangering the animals that shared their land. For now, they mourned. It was a quiet morning in Alaska's Kenai Peninsula. But the stillness was deceptive, a fragile silence blanketing a small, peaceful cove on the Kenai River. Joe and Marty, 2 fishermen, had arrived early, drawn by the promise of salmon-rich waters. Their boat rocked gently, tethered to the shore, while the men stood knee-deep in the icy shallows, casting their lines. The only sounds were the lapping of water and the occasional cry of a distant gull. Joe noticed it first, a cluster of broken branches near the tree line, and claw marks scored deep into a birch. It was fresh, the sap still oozing. He paused, his gut tightening. Marty dismissed the signs with a casual wave of his hand. They had seen bear activity before, but it always felt distant, a threat that loomed at the edges of their lives without ever truly crossing the line. Ignoring their unease, they fished on, the rhythm of their casting pulling them back into focus. Joe hooked a fat silver salmon, its thrashing a brief excitement that momentarily erased his tension. He reeled it in, grinning as the fish flopped into the shallows. But then a low, guttural noise broke the quiet and sent ice down Joe's spine. A grizzly, larger than any they'd ever encountered, emerged from the tree line. Its fur was matted with mud, and its eyes glinted with a cold, calculating intelligence worthy of an apex predator. It was too close, just 50 yards away, its massive, muscular frame moving with intent. This wasn't a bear wandering through. It was a predator closing in. The fishermen froze, their breath caught in their throats. The grizzly stared, unblinking, then began to move along the shoreline, its gait slow and deliberate. Joe whispered for them to retreat to the boat, but Marty hesitated, gripping his fishing rod like it offered protection. They were too exposed. The boat felt miles away, and the water, once a refuge, now felt like a trap. The bear stopped, sniffing the air, its nose twitching. Human scent, the fish, hunger. It made its decision instantly, dropping onto all fours and charging with terrifying speed. Joe yelled and stumbled backward, the cold water splashing up to his waist. The grizzly hit Marty first. Marty's body flew back, his fishing rod snapping in two. He hit the water with a loud splash. The bear didn't hesitate, following him into the shallows, its claws raking across Marty's chest and arms. The water churned red as Marty screamed, flailing uselessly against the beast's relentless assault. Joe instinctively grabbed an oar from the boat and swung it wildly. The wood cracked against the bear's shoulder but didn't flinch. It turned its head, locking its gaze on Joe. Its eyes burned with a feral intensity, and in that moment, Joe knew it saw him as nothing more than prey. The bear lunged, swiping with its massive paw. Joe barely dodged, the air around him seeming to shatter with the force of the blow. He scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the slick rocks. Behind him, Marty tried to crawl toward the boat, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his blood leaving a crimson trail in the water. The bear roared so deep that it vibrated in Joe's chest. It lunged again, its claws raking across his thigh. Pain exploded through him, but he didn't stop. He swung the oar again, aiming for the bear's head, but this time, the bear caught the weapon in its jaws, snapping it in two like a twig. Joe turned and ran, splashing toward the boat. The bear gave chase, its bulk creating waves that knocked him off balance. He reached the side of the boat and heaved himself up, collapsing into the bottom as his injured leg screamed in protest. He grabbed the edge, pulling Marty's limp body closer. The water around his friend was dark with blood, but he wasn't dead, not yet. The bear hit the side of the boat, nearly capsizing it. Joe fumbled for the motor, his hands slick with water and sweat. The bear's claws scraped against the metal, leaving deep gouges. It roared again, its frustration mounting as it realized its prey was slipping away. Finally, the motor sputtered to life. The boat lurched forward, leaving the grizzly thrashing in the shallows. Joe didn't look back, focusing entirely on Marty, who lay pale and motionless at his feet. His chest was a mess of torn flesh, the deep wounds pumping blood with every faint heartbeat. Joe pressed his hands against Marty's wounds, trying to staunch the bleeding, but it was no use. His friend's breaths came in short, shallow bursts, and his eyes fluttered, unfocused. The grizzly's roars faded into the distance as the boat carried them away, but the terror clung to Joe, sharp and suffocating. It was too late when Joe reached the shore and called for help. Marty's body was cold. He was dead. The grizzly had taken more than his life. It had left Joe with a weight he would carry forever. The scene repeated in his mind. The bear's charge, the way it moved with purpose, the helplessness of watching his friend be torn apart. The attack affected the larger fishing community. Safety measures were reviewed, warning signs erected, and fishermen were urged to carry bear spray and firearms. But none of it could erase what had happened. Joe bore the scars, not just the jagged ones on his leg, but the ones carved deep into his soul. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bear, smelled the blood, and heard the roar. Following the incident, Joe never fished again. The campfire crackled, its glow casting flickering shadows across the tall pines surrounding the remote lodge as four friends laughed and shared stories. Maddie, Greg, Elena, and Sophie were enjoying a weekend escape to the wilderness. The crisp Montana night wrapped around them like a blanket. Everything had been perfect so far. The stars stretched endlessly above them, unpolluted by city lights, and the air smelled of pine and earth. Greg poked at the fire, sending up a shower of sparks, while Maddie emptied the remains of their dinner into a nearby bin. A faint rustle from the tree line caught Elena's attention, but she dismissed it as the wind or a small animal. It wasn't until Sophie pointed out movement, a large shadow just beyond the campfire's reach, that they all froze. They soon saw it was a bear. The grizzly stood on all fours, head low, sniffing the air. Its coat was matted, its ribs visible beneath its thick fur. By the looks of it, the animal was starving, and the smell of food scraps had lured it too close. The friends scrambled to their feet, instinctive fear replacing their light-hearted mood. Greg grabbed a flashlight and shone it at the bear, hoping the sudden brightness would startle it. The grizzly flinched, a low growl rumbling in its throat, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it moved closer, its massive paws crunching on the dirt. Maddie yelled and waved a burning stick, trying to drive it back. The bear hesitated, its black eyes locked on the movement. For a moment it seemed like the fire would deter it, but then hunger overrode fear. It charged forward, teeth bared, forcing the group to scatter. Greg grabbed Sophie's arm and dragged her toward the lodge. Elena followed, heart pounding as the bear roared behind her. Maddie stayed behind, still wielding the flaming stick. He swung it at the bear, buying precious seconds for his friends to make it safely. The bear reared up on its hind legs, towering over him. He backpedaled, the firelight catching the whites of his wide eyes as he turned and ran. The others slammed the door shut just as Maddie threw himself inside. The bear barreled into the wooden door a moment later, the impact almost strong enough to shake the lodge. It let out a deep, guttural growl, its claws raking against the wood, leaving deep gouges. Inside, the friends were frantic. They barricaded the door with furniture and checked the windows, but the bear wasn't giving up. It circled the building, its heavy footfalls audible on the wooden porch. Every so often, it lunged at a window or tried the back door, its determination unnerving. The lodge, which had felt so cozy hours ago, now felt like a fragile barrier between them and the beast. They spent hours listening to the bear's growls and claws scraping against the walls. They tried to stay quiet, but every creak of the floor or whispered word felt deafening. Elena clutched a knife from the kitchen, her knuckles white. Greg held a fire poker, though his shaking hands betrayed his fear. Sophie sat in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the door as if willing it to hold. Hours passed, and the bear continued to circle the lodge. Every crash against the walls made them jump. Finally, Maddie, tired of waiting and increasingly agitated, decided to act. He grabbed a flare gun they had brought for emergencies and motioned toward the back door. The others begged him to stay, but Maddie's jaw was set. He thought it might finally leave if he could scare the bear enough. He unlatched the door just enough to slip outside, not wanting to risk his friend's safety. The cold air hit Maddie, and his breath fogged as he moved slowly onto the porch. The bear stood a short distance away, its massive body illuminated by the moonlight. It turned its head toward him, sniffing the air. Maddie raised the flare gun and fired. The red streak shot into the sky, bright and crackling. For a moment, the bear recoiled, startled by the sudden light and sound. Maddie shouted, hoping it would flee, but instead the bear turned its attention fully on him. Angered and more aggressive than ever, it charged faster than Maddie could react. He stumbled back, the flare gun falling from his hands. The bear hit him full force, sending him sprawling onto the porch. Its claws slashed at his chest, tearing through his jacket and into his flesh. Maddie screamed, the sound raw and animalistic, as he fought to push the bear off. Blood splattered across the wooden boards, glistening in the moonlight. Inside, the others were paralyzed by the horror unfolding outside. Greg grabbed the fire poker and ran to the door, throwing it open and shouting to distract the bear. Elena and Sophie dragged Maddie's limp body inside as Greg swung wildly, keeping the bear at bay long enough to slam the door shut again. The grizzly roared, slamming its body against the door with renewed fury. Greg leaned against it, his breath ragged, as blood pooled beneath Matty on the floor. His wounds were deep, his chest and arm shredded. Elena ripped her jacket into strips, trying to staunch the bleeding, but her hands were slick with blood, and her makeshift bandages were quickly soaked. The bear continued its assault on the lodge, but its attacks grew weaker as the night dragged on. By dawn it was gone, retreating into the forest as the first light crept over the horizon. The friends sat silently, huddled together, their faces pale and hollow. With dawn came help. Matty's breathing was shallow, his skin clammy. Rescuers transported him to the nearest hospital. The ordeal left scars deeper than the physical ones. None spoke of it for weeks after returning home, but the memories lingered in every shadow, every sharp sound. The wilderness, once a place of beauty and escape, was now a landscape of fear. And in their nightmares, the bear circled the lodge endlessly, and there was no way to escape. It was almost evening on a small ranch in Wyoming. The rancher, a man named Glenn, stood at his kitchen window, the orange glow of the sunset casting long shadows across his property. Glenn sipped his third coffee of the day, his eyes narrowing at the silhouette of the barn in the distance. Something was wrong. The unusual sound of garbage cans tipping over drifted to him through the open window. The familiar crunch of heavy paws on gravel followed. He placed the mug down, grabbing his rifle from the rack by the door. His dog, Buck, a loyal cattle dog with sharp instincts, stood at his feet, ears perked and hackles raised. Together, they stepped outside into the cool evening air. The ranch was eerily quiet except for the distant rustling near the barn. The smell hit Glenn before he saw it, a strong mix of musk, rotten garbage, and damp fur. As they approached, the shadows shifted, revealing the hulking frame of a grizzly bear, its head buried in a trash can. Its coat was patchy, its ribs visible even under the bulk of its body. Glenn knew the animal was probably starving, which made it even more dangerous. The rancher stopped, his heart pounding. Buck growled low in his throat, his body rigid with tension. The bear froze, lifting its massive head from the garbage. The air thickened as predator and human sized each other up. Slowly, Glenn raised his rifle, aiming just above the bear. He pulled the trigger. The grizzly flinched, its ears flattening, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it roared and charged, a blur of muscle and fury. Buck barked wildly and surged forward, intercepting the bear before it could reach his master. Teeth bared, Buck leaped for the bear's face, snapping and dodging its massive claws. Glenn fired again, but the shot went wide. The bear swiped at Buck, sending the dog tumbling across the dirt. Buck yelped but scrambled to his feet, his side streaked with blood. He lunged at the bear again, fearless and relentless. Glenn turned to run, his boots slipping on the gravel as he made for the barn. His heart thundered in his chest as he threw open the door and stumbled inside. He slammed it shut, bolting it as the bear hit it with a thundering crash. From outside, Buck barked again, the sound growing more frantic. Glenn could hear the bear's roars, the sharp clash of claws against wood, and a yelp. He froze, his hands gripping the rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Buck's barks faltered, replaced by low, pained whimpers. The bear turned its attention back to the barn, its weight slamming into the door repeatedly. The wood splintered under the assault, the bolts straining to hold. The rancher backed away, climbing into the hayloft, his breathing ragged. He could see the bear through the cracks in the door, its fur matted with blood, its eyes wild with rage. With one final blow, the door gave way. The grizzly stormed inside, its massive frame filling the small space. Glenn steadied his rifle, firing a shot into the bear's shoulder. It roared in pain but didn't stop, its claws raking at the ladder as it tried to climb. Desperate, the man grabbed a pitchfork and jabbed it downward. The sharp tines pierced the bear's thick hide, and it fell back, thrashing on the ground. For a moment, it seemed like the fight might be over. But the bear dragged itself to its feet, blood dripping from its wounds, and turned its gaze upward again. Before it could charge, the rancher fired one last shot. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make the bear stumble out of the barn, disappearing into the darkness. Glenn climbed down slowly, his body trembling. He stepped outside, his heart sinking as he saw Buck lying near the barn. The dog's fur was slick with blood, his body battered and broken. Kneeling beside him, Glenn placed a trembling hand on Buck's side. The dog didn't move. By morning, local authorities arrived, their trucks kicking up dust clouds as they pulled onto the property. They inspected the barn, the garbage, and the bloody tracks leading into the wilderness. Glenn recounted the attack, his voice hollow as he described Buck's sacrifice. The wildlife officers explained the grim reality. The bear's desperation had driven it to aggression. It was unlikely to retreat far, and its behavior made it a danger to anyone nearby. They set traps along the tree line, determined to capture the animal. 2 days later, they succeeded. The bear was found in one of the traps, its massive frame slumped in defeat. Authorities decided to euthanize it, citing the risk it posed to the community. Glenn watched from his porch as the truck carrying the bear disappeared down the dirt road. The sight brought little comfort. In the days that followed, the ranch felt emptier. The barn door was repaired and the trash cleaned up, but Buck's absence was a wound that didn't heal. The rancher buried him beneath a tree near the pasture, a simple wooden marker standing above the grave. The bear was gone, but the memory of its fury and the price paid to survive remained. The whole community was affected by the attack. The story of Buck's bravery and loyalty spread and became almost legendary. The Canadian Rockies stretched endlessly, jagged peaks framing the crystal-clear lake where the Owens family had decided to picnic. It was the spot that belonged on a postcard, with its turquoise waters and the faint scent of pine drifting on the breeze. Peter, the father, unpacked sandwiches while his wife Lori spread a blanket on the soft grass. Their 3 children, Claire, 11, and the twins, Max and Jesse, 8, laughed and chased each other near the water's edge. The beauty of the scene masked the hidden dangers of the wilderness. Wildlife signs were posted throughout the park, warning about keeping food secure and watching for bears. But the family, like many visitors, assumed the odds of an encounter were slim. They didn't know that a grizzly bear foraged nearby beyond the tree line. It was lean, its smallish body the result of a harsh season. Hunger sharpened its senses, and when the wind shifted, it caught a scent that made it pause. Food, rich and tempting. The bear raised its head, sniffing deeply. Slowly, it began to move toward the source. When Peter noticed the dark shape strolling through the trees, he immediately became alert. He watched it momentarily, his hand tightening on the sandwich he held. When the bear stepped into the clearing, his stomach dropped. It looked somewhat deranged and far too close for comfort. The children froze, their laughter silenced. Lori stood, her face pale, pulling Max and Jesse toward her. Peter raised his arms high, trying to appear larger, his voice calm but firm as he motioned for his family to back away. The bear hesitated, watching them with dark, unblinking eyes. For a moment, it worked. The bear snorted, pawed at the ground, and turned as if to retreat. But then it caught the scent of the picnic, the smell of sandwiches, fruit, and snacks spread out on the blanket. Its instincts overrode any hesitation. It growled, low and menacing, and took a step forward. Peter's heart pounded as he positioned himself between the bear and his family. He waved his arms, shouting louder now, but the bear focused on the food. It came closer, its movements deliberate and slow, its growls rising in volume. The bear stopped a few feet away, standing on all fours, its muscles coiled with tension. When Peter picked up a large branch and swung it, the bear roared, a sound that reverberated through the clearing and froze everyone in place. Then it charged. Peter barely had time to react before the bear was on him. Its massive paw swiped at the man, sending him sprawling to the ground. The pain was sharp, unlike anything Peter had ever felt before. He rolled onto his back, raising the branch like a shield as the bear lunged again. Its claws raked down, splintering the wood and tearing through his shirt. Blood stained the grass as he struggled to push the beast off. Lori screamed, pulling the children farther back. The twins clung to her, crying, while Claire grabbed a rock and hurled it at the bear. It bounced harmlessly off its thick hide, but the sudden movement distracted the animal for a split second. Peter kicked out with all his strength, his boot connecting with the bear's snout. The grizzly growled and staggered back, shaking its head. It looked at him again, its dark eyes filled with a terrifying hunger and rage. For a moment, Peter thought it might lunge again, but then it shifted its attention to the picnic blanket. The bear sniffed at the scattered food, tearing into the sandwiches with its teeth. Peter dragged himself backward, his breaths ragged and shallow. Blood trickled from the deep gashes in his side, soaking his torn shirt. He motioned for Lori to take the kids and run, his voice weak but urgent. She hesitated, torn between staying and getting the children to safety. Then, from a distance came the sound of voices, hikers approaching. The bear froze, its ears twitching as it listened. The voices grew louder, closer, mingling with the crunch of boots on gravel. The grizzly turned and lumbered back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had come. Peter slumped to the ground, his vision swimming. Lori rushed to him, pressing her jacket against his wounds in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. The hikers arrived moments later, their faces pale as they entered the scene. One of them called for help, his voice steady despite the panic in his eyes. Paramedics arrived within the hour, stabilizing Peter and loading him onto a stretcher. He drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain dulling as shock set in. The children huddled together, their faces streaked with tears, while Lori stayed at Peter's side, her hand gripping his tightly. The family survived, but the encounter left scars that went far beyond the physical. Peter spent weeks recovering, the deep gashes on his side a constant reminder of how close they had come to disaster. The children had nightmares for months, their once innocent view of the wilderness replaced by a gnawing fear of what lurked in the shadows. Park authorities launched an investigation, tracking the bear through the forest. They found its behavior unchanged near another picnic site days later. It was clear the animal had become a danger to humans, and the difficult decision was made to euthanize it. The incident prompted the park to tighten regulations, adding bear-proof bins and patrols to discourage close encounters. The Owens family never returned to the Rockies, and the shadow of near tragedy overshadows their memories of the tranquil lake. What was once a sanctuary of peace and beauty had become a haunting reminder of nature's raw power. For Peter, each scar etched into his skin was more than a mark. It was a testament to survival, a symbol of a family that had stared into the wild's unforgiving eyes and lived to tell the tale. Yet those scars also carried a sobering truth. In the wilderness, nature's rules reign supreme, and humanity, for all its strength and resolve, often finds itself humbled by the untamed. Harry adjusted the lens on his camera, the crisp air of Alaska's wilderness biting at his fingers. He stood at the edge of a vast glacier, its jagged ice glowing faintly in the soft light of the overcast sky. The rest of the photography group was farther behind, lingering near the base camp. Harry couldn't resist venturing ahead, chasing the perfect shot. The silence around him was immense, broken only by the occasional creak of the glacier and the crunch of his boots on snow. His focus narrowed on the landscape, the camera capturing every glint of ice, every shadow. He didn't notice the faint sounds in the distance, or the subtle shift in the wind that carried an unfamiliar, musky scent. The grizzly had been watching him for some time, its massive body hidden among the rocks on the slope. Harry was an intruder to the bear, a lone figure moving through its territory. The animal stood, sniffing the air, its dark eyes tracking his every move. It padded closer, its bulk nearly silent against the snow. Harry turned, the hair on the back of his neck rising. At first he saw only movement, something large and fluid. And then the bear emerged fully into view. It was massive, its fur thick and dark, its muscles rippling as it moved deliberately. Harry froze, his camera dangling uselessly at his side. The bear was too close, closer than any bear should have been. Instinctively, he began to back away, his boots slipping slightly on the icy ground. The bear growled a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the air. It wasn't a curious noise. It was a warning. The bear's head lowered, its shoulders rolling forward as it prepared to charge. Harry glanced behind him. The incline was steep, the glacier's edge jagged and treacherous. Running wasn't an option. His breath quickened and his hands tightened around his tripod, the only thing resembling a weapon in his possession. Harry swung the tripod as the bear lunged, the metal striking its snout with a hollow clang. The bear reared back, momentarily stunned, but the blow only enraged it further. Claws sliced through Harry's jacket, maiming his chest. In an instant, he was on the ground, bloody and in pain. Desperate to survive, Harry scrambled to his feet, swinging the tripod again as the bear advanced. The makeshift weapon struck the bear's shoulder this time, but didn't slow. It swiped again, catching Harry's arm and sending him crashing into the snow. The cold bit into him, but the adrenaline dulled the sting. He kicked out wildly, his boot connecting with the bear's jaw. It growled, its massive jaws snapping inches from his face. Harry struggled to his knees, his vision blurring as blood dripped from a gash on his forehead. He grabbed the tripod again, gripping it tightly despite the pain in his arm. When the bear lunged again, he thrust the tripod upward, jamming it into the animal's chest. The bear roared, shaking its head violently, and Harry felt the metal snap under the pressure. He fell back, gasping, the broken tripod clattering to the ground. The bear loomed over him, its breath visible in the freezing air. It swiped again, catching his leg this time. Pain exploded in his calf, and he cried out, the sound raw and desperate. Then, as if moved by an invisible hand, the bear left. Harry couldn't believe his eyes. As soon as the bear was gone, he started crying, salty tears streaming down his face. The bear was gone. But he was alone in the middle of nowhere and had no phone. In the worst-case scenario, the bear would return and finish what it had started. In the best-case scenario, the elements would claim him before the bear could. These were the thoughts swirling in Harry's mind for hours. But then, a second miracle took place. Faint voices echoed from the distance, growing louder. Harry's group had heard the commotion and searched for him ever since. They were closing in. Harry lay still, his chest heaving, every breath a struggle. His body was a mess of torn clothes and bloody wounds. The cold seeped into him, numbing the sharp edges of pain but bringing a dangerous lethargy. He tried to call out again, but his voice was weak. Minutes felt like hours before the group arrived. The sight of him sprawled on the ice, blood pooling beneath him, drew gasps of horror. They moved quickly, wrapping him in jackets and using a sled to haul him back to base camp. Every jolt of the ride sent fresh waves of pain through him, but Harry clung to consciousness, his mind replaying the attack in vivid, unbearable detail. By the time they reached help, his injuries were severe but not fatal. Deep gashes ran across his chest and leg, and his arm was bruised and swollen. The scars would heal in time, but the memory of the bear's eyes, its roar, and the sheer force of its attack were carved into him permanently. News of the attack spread quickly, prompting renewed warnings about the dangers of venturing alone in bear country. Park rangers found signs of the grizzly's tracks near the glacier, confirming its presence. They urged visitors to stay in groups, carry bear spray, and remain vigilant. The experience left behind more than just physical scars for Harry. It reshaped his perception of the world. Every creak of ice, every whisper of the wind, became a haunting echo of that fateful day, pulling him back into the moment when survival hung by a thread. Though he returned to photography, his passion for capturing the wild was forever changed. He never ventured into the wilderness again, the weight of solitude now carrying an edge of fear he couldn't shake. Once a muse of beauty and inspiration, the glacier was now indelibly marked in his mind, a stark reminder of nature's unforgiving power and how a single, seemingly insignificant misstep could spiral into a life-or-death battle against the elements.